minutes. Our first presenter is Jānis Oga from the Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art of the University of Latvia. And the title of the presentation is Latvian Novels from the 1970s and 1980s, Publications after the Collapse of the Soviet Union.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Hello, everybody. I will try to share my screen. Unfortunately, sometimes I'd love to see both the presentation and the text I'm going to read. I'm trying to do my best. So is it visible now?
Yes, that's all right.
Great, thank you. Okay, so my paper is based on studies of the relations between the most popular and recognized Latvian prose writers, known as the Soviet intelligentsia, and the occupation regime of the middle and late Soviet period, from 1968 to 1991, that partly overlaps the stagnation period, a popular and convenient term to describe the era of Leonid Brezhnev, which lasted until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. The usual focus has been shifted from dissidents to writers recognized both by official critics and readers. And the power of the word and literature as a communication channel in the Soviet occupation system is at the center of my study. And it has been claimed that, quote, the political, public, and scholarly debate over this period in Soviet history is often wedged over the lines of pre-crisis or pre-renewal, end quote. It also has been stressed that when the Soviet Union collapsed, despite Gorbachev's reforms and attempts to modernize the country, stagnation became the primary explanation of the failure of the Soviet Socialist project. Latvia's situation in this period has been directly linked to its geopolitical position. The Estonian scholar F. Annus has introduced the Western borderlands concept regarding the Baltic states, countries that quote, enjoyed the advantage of a still active pre-Soviet cultural memory in comparison with those lands where Sovietization processes started immediately in the post-revolutionary years. In the Western borderlands, a living memory kept alive continuities with pre-Soviet times, end quote. And these continuities were strengthened by visits to the neighboring West and other foreign countries, the acquisition of prohibited or partly permitted literary works, contacts with like-minded people in neighboring countries, and by the Latvian intelligentsia in exile. And through the works published in the 1970s and 80s, together with oral memory, writers encouraged nonviolent resistance and a return to the pre-war system of Western and democratic values. In contrast to the West, where literary works often leave an impact only on narrow intellectual circles or serve the entertainment industry, in the Soviet system, literature played an enormous role in almost everyone's life. Thus, it was the popular writers and their works which reflected both European and general democratic values, who recorded and anticipated changes in the Soviet system and prepared society for those changes. The revival of the democratic values and the irreversible social liberalization which occurred in the late stage of the Soviet system. And the writers selected for my study were born between 1910 and 1938, and relatively speaking represent three generations. Writers who had already grown up before 1940, so before the Soviet occupation, so they were born between 1910 and 1922. The second group is writers who were teenagers until the 1940s. and whose view of the world was related to their experiences before the war. And the third group are writers who were children in 1940 and whose view of the world was formed during the Soviet times. So they were born in 1928 and after. And among the representatives of the first generation are mostly writers loyal to the Soviet regime. Most of their work were no longer relevant after the restoration of independence and were not published in new editions in 1990s and later, with rare exceptions as a writer as a composer Mardir Zarinj, whose novel The Counterfeit Faust, or A Corrected and Expanded Cookbook from 1973 is considered to be the first Latvian postmodern novel and has been published in 2 reissues after that. The text has not been changed as the author has not created different versions of his work. And the edition of 2003 include the author comments, glossary of dialects. Actually, this annex is redundant and to some extent contrary to the postmodern nature of the text. A special case is Vera Katsana, who represents the so-called people of the idea. After the 1959 campaign against the National Communists, her literary publications were not allowed. So she, despite of being communist, can also be considered being a dissident, though she did not look for opportunities and earned a living with her translations. She is also one of the very few writers who actually has created so-called drama literature, as her novels, The Walker at War and The Ball Ended at Midnight, though were written in the 1970s, were published only in 2012 and 2013. The second generation writers who were teenagers until the 1940s is represented by Zygmunt Skuinš, born in 1926. He is one of the most outstanding and popular Latvian writers in the second half of the 20th century. From the mid-50s, Skuinš and other prose writers of his generation restored the connection with the pre-war Latvian literature. His works have been published in about 7 million copies in more than 20 languages, ranking him among the most translated Latvian writers. The novels Nakedness and Flesh-Colored Dominoes have recently been translated into English. Skuinš has claimed that, quote, "I never wanted to join the party. I didn't have to. No one has led me. I have not commanded anywhere. I have chosen everything myself. I've never said what I don't think. You may not talk at all because it is not said that you actually need to talk. And according to my deepest conviction, writers fall just into 2 categories, dilettantes and commercial writers." And he claims himself that he is, of course, commercial writer with huge success. Of course, the censorship existed, and also Skuinš had to deal with it. He has claimed in 2005, quote, that "nor does it occur to me to hide that I have tried to write my works in such a way that they go through and reach the readers. But it would be an idiot, not a carpenter, who would make shelves regardless of the width and height of the doors." Or, as his colleague Mirvaldis Birdze has stated in 1995, "All my life I have been writing with the thought, will it go through? Because that was a time when we created the literature of those truths," end quote. Compared to other writers of his generation and younger, Skuinš can feel happy because his works have been published repeatedly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In collected works in 10 volumes from 2005 to 2011, as well as in several other editions. In his collected works, Skuinš did not include his first 3 novels, among them the very popular novel Grandsons of Columbus from 1961. Skuinš is an outstanding stylist, and throughout his life, but especially since 1990s, he has been carefully reviewing and stylistically correcting most of his work. And I would like to focus on 2 of his novels. Memoir of a young man, Jauna Cilvēka memoir, came out in 1981 with a print run of 100,000, with new editions 20 years and 30 years later. The novel has been translated in several languages, including Russian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Czech, Polish, and others. The novel is written as a memoir of the 20-year-old student and as an observation of the world, his relationships with girlfriend, parents, friends, university professors, and others. In the new edition, the author has added comments and endnotes created by his daughter Inga Skuinja with the assistance of the author. Skuinja also has made stylistic improvements, making the space and details of the plot vague. For example, in the beginning of the novel, I remember it happened in our faculty library. Zelma waited for the discussion to begin. What really I will not recall. We once counted that Zelma has 12 different social responsibilities. I had 10 free minutes until the grade sector meeting. We stood at the window and looked at the Greek profile of the opera house. In the edition of 2001 and 2011, only two sentences of this paragraph remain. And at the end of the novel, there is a paragraph where Kalvis Zariņš stated that, as far as I know, Zelma is married. Her husband, the artist, restores antique paintings, and he continues describing her. That she's writing articles and also giving lectures, and that he had seen her in Volga. And actually, this paragraph does not appear in the contemporary editions at all. The author adds tension to the text, reduces irrelevant information, focusing on the main character's emotional experience. The same he did with the novel The Man in His Prime from 1974, new edition in 2008, about a middle-aged man, about his relationship with his wife and a new colleague, and in parallel with development of innovative engineering solutions at the VEF factory. At the same time, it cannot be said that the author would like to get rid of the characteristics of the era. On the contrary, the new editions of the novel is full of the signs of the times, and many of them are also explained in the endnotes. Like Palanga, the most famous resort in Lithuania, adding a comment that one summer day immediately after the publication of this particular novel, a Lithuanian eyewitness on the beach of Palanga saw that everybody was reading this novel. Another endnote, driving to Cēsis, town of Latvia, with a tractor, a sign of the times. I'm quoting, there were few personal cars in the countryside. Shared equipment and cheap fuel encouraged wasteful, absurd behavior. People used to drive a tractor even to the store. A poorly arranged everyday life, artificial obstacles to living improvements, emptied individual houses in the countryside, and they were bought cheaply by the intelligentsia from Riga, end quote. Or fluent in English, what does it mean? Explaining that also English was taught in schools and universities, a good knowledge of foreign languages was a shadow of somebody's biography rather than the other way around. Why do you speak a foreign language? For what purpose? End quote. Although it must be admitted that the author's corrections have made the novel more intense, the first version of the book from 1981 could be more useful for understanding the period in the turn of the 1970s and 1980s. Skuinj's next novel, The Bed with a Golden Leg, from 1984, is one of the most essential Latvian novels written in 1980s and the most popular, with a total print run of almost 200,000 for 1 million readers. That was Latin-speaking population at the time. It was published 3 times during the Soviet period and twice after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 2008 in collected works and in 2015 within series for use in schools. Both editions include comments by Squinch, originally written in 1988. Unlike Memoirs of a Young Man, the text of this novel is republished almost intact, with relatively small stylistic changes. This is probably due to the fact that the novel is about history and was already intended in such a way that both the details and adventures of characters are of equal importance. Squinch himself has also stated that this is his favorite work, and the only book about which, after finishing, he has had feeling that everything has been said. Regarding historical references in the plot of the novel, Squinch uses everything available to him at the time, including until then hidden and undisclosed facts like Stalin's Great Purge from 1936 to 38 in Moscow, deportations, Latvian legionnaires during Second World War, and others. So this can be also interpreted, the end of the novel, that the sign of a population is dwindling viability, because some critics claimed that the nation had become hasty. But even after the restoration of independence, Squinch has not tried to correct or supplement anything. The author's notes mostly explain historical persons and very few of Soviet realities, like a factory house, affordable family house manufactured in a factory, and others. So the next generation writers who were children in 1940 and whose view of the world was formed during the Soviet time, they are represented by Regina Azara and Albert Bels. In 2000 and 2001, Azara's selected works were published. She is one of the popular writers who never added anything to her published text. In an interview, she has mentioned that she has never had the time or desire to return to her previous work, and that all her creative energy has always been concentrated on her current work. Albert Bels originally wrote his novel Insomnia in 1967. The commission of experts recognized as an anti-Soviet pamphlet written in the form of nightmares and gossips. And criminal case was filed against the writer. The novel was not released in its uncensored form until 2003. It was published first in 1986 in the literary periodical Karux and in a book among other novels by Bels a year later. In the edition of 2003, the censored sentences and paragraphs have been added to the text along with the author's preface and the original document. The conclusion of the expert group about this anti-state nature of the novel. Significant is the author's statement that he had created an abbreviated version of the novel in 1986 because he did not see the possibility that the Soviet occupation could ever end. The conclusion would be that since regaining independence, many popular Latvian novels from the 1970s and 80s have been published in new editions within writers' complete work series for use in schools and other publications. Some of them remain untouched and supplemented only by authors or literary scholars' prefaces or comments. On the contrary, some authors have edited their work and presented new versions of their text to be considered new canons and their last will with different approaches. Editing previously published text, including addition of censored fragments or detailed endnotes, or improving a writer's style. However, it should be emphasized that in most cases, the text of the novels in republications have remained intact, suggesting that the writers in the novels managed to say enough about both what was allowed and what was not allowed. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I believe that we will have questions and comments for all the presenters in the end of the session. So our next presenter is Thomas Fritzmeier from High School of Economics Moscow campus. And the title of the presentation is Continuous discontinuities.
Excuse me, I think there might be a small misunderstanding. I talked to Professor Yugin yesterday because I have a health issue.
Oh yeah.
I suffered a heat stroke yesterday, and I'm sort of calling in with a fever. And Professor Yugin moved my presentation to Saturday at 3.
Oh,
yes, we rescheduled that actually.
I'm sorry, I didn't know about that.
No problem.
Sorry about your problems. So but other presentations are so no additional changes in this panel. Am I right?
No additional changes. We just rescheduled Thomas for tomorrow.
Okay.
You can check it later.
In this instance, thank you very much for that, for making that very easy.
About your
really
health problem.
Condition yet.
Right. So our next presenter is Timothy Atanucci, Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz, and the title of the presentation is Recycling Critical Theory for Socialist Melancholy in Wege Sebald's The Ring of Saturn.
So thank you for the introduction. Thomas, I hope you feel better soon. And I will try to share my screen now. Okay, is that all right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference very much for this invitation to speak at this conference. All the more so because my area of expertise in modern German literature falls outside of the field of Eastern European literature and culture. And the topic of my paper, the Bavarian writer W.G. Sebald, who lived for most of his adult life in England, has very little direct relationship to Eastern Europe, the former East Germany, or Soviet culture. If anything, Sebald's work on European cultural memory, notably in his novels The Emigrants and Austerlitz, but also in The Rings of Saturn, can serve to illustrate Aleida Aßmann's observation that there is a notable asymmetry between West and East in the memory cultures of contemporary Europe. Like most of his West German contemporaries, Sebald's novels focus on the Second World War and the Holocaust, largely ignoring traumatic events on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Sebald's literary work is an interesting case, however, for exploring the relationship between Marxism and memory, which, as Enzo Traverso suggests in his book Left-Wing Melancholia, have long been opposed. Not only has Marxism always been oriented towards the future of socialism, but the turn to memory studies in Western Europe in the 1980s and 1990s largely ignored the Marxist tradition, whether it focused on places of memory with national significance or the after effects of trauma. As Traverso shows, the bipolar concept of melancholia can help to bridge the gap between Marxism and memory. Left-wing melancholia is based both on the long memory of Marxist defeats from 1848 to the Paris Commune to 1989. This would be the depressive or mournful pole of melancholy, and the renewed memory of socialism's future, the euphoric or utopian pole. Despite Svetlana Boym's rejection of the term melancholy in her work on nostalgia, I think that Traverso's understanding of the concept closely aligns with her ideas about reflective nostalgia, an imagination that recognizes what is lost as lost, but also a source for critical reflection. Melancholia, a discourse with roots in antiquity, is also an excellent topic for studying the history of cultural recycling. The black bile, a bodily fluid imagined to complete the scheme of 4 humors in ancient medicine, has proved to be one of the most recyclable materials in European culture. As a literary scholar himself, and in particular as a reader of Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, Sebald is aware of how various periods, from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and Baroque to Romanticism and the critical theory of the 20th century, have returned to the traditional discourse of melancholy, each time taking up and transforming its various tropes. Today, in a reading of his novel The Rings of Saturn from 1996, I would like to show how Sebald recycles melancholy discourse as it appears in Benjamin's critical theory and how he transforms it into a poetological principle. Because of Sebald's close ties to critical theory, I believe his use of melancholia is not only left-wing, but also post-socialist. In this reading, the post-socialist condition is defined by the loss of a utopia. For the new edition of his book Melancholy and Society, first published in 1969, the German sociologist Wolf Lepenius describes 1989 not as the end of history, but as the end of utopia. In the original study, Lepenius had demonstrated how melancholy and utopia were deeply intertwined in the modern cultural imagination. Lepenius reads Robert Burton's introduction to The Anatomy of Melancholy from 1621 as a work of political utopia on par with Thomas Morris's Island narrative. In this introduction, Burton assumes a pseudonym, Democritus Jr., named after the ancient philosopher whom others describe as crazy and melancholic. The philosopher, however, is merely studying melancholy, dissecting animals in search of the seat of the black bile in the body. In the same way, the critic of the state appears to others as an outsider, but is in fact the only one who can discover how the state itself is melancholy and how it might be cured. The depressed or melancholy view of the world is thus a precondition for the utopian imagination of how to change it. If Lepenius and Traverso are right, then the end of utopia and left-wing melancholia described the affective environment in which Sebald wrote his major prose works, including The Rings of Saturn. This novel announces its relationship to melancholy in its title. Saturn is the planet associated with the melancholic type since antiquity. The novel's subtitle, An English Pilgrimage, eine englische Wallfahrt, recalls the topos of melancholy as the English malady and addresses religion and travel as both sources and cures for the disease. Other paratexts suggest how the theme of melancholy translates into a poetic form, in particular the novel's third motto, a quotation from the Brockhaus Encyclopedia's article on the planet Saturn. The rings of Saturn consist of ice crystals and probably meteorite particles describing circular orbits around the planet's equator. In all likelihood, these are fragments of a former moon that was too close to the planet and was destroyed by its tidal effect. See the Roche limit. This motto contains the poetological principle of the novel. Over the course of several walks through the English countryside, the narrator will investigate fragments of the past, which all point to a history of destruction. The lack of a specific time in the motto is also characteristic. What matters for the Rings of Saturn is not the millions or billions of years that have passed since this destructive event, the destruction of a moon, but the fact of the event itself, and more importantly, the fact that the past destruction is inseparable from the present state of the planet. Sebald's novel can thus address various timescales, from the recent past to the historical past to the longue durée of human history, and even to the deep time of geology or astronomy, all of which appear under the same melancholic gaze. Sebald explains this poetological principle and ties it to the discourse of melancholy on the novel's first page, which is worth quoting at length. And I hope you'll get a sense of the novel from these few longer quotations. In August 1992, when the dog days were drawing to an end, I set off to walk the county of Suffolk. in the hope of dispelling the emptiness that takes hold of me whenever I have completed a long stint of work. And in fact, my hope was realized, up to a point. For I have seldom felt so carefully as I did then, walking for hours in the day through the thinly populated countryside, which stretches inland from the coast. I wonder now, however, whether there might be something in the old superstition that certain ailments of the spirit and the body are particularly likely to beset us under the sign of the dog star. At all events, in retrospect, I became preoccupied not only with the unaccustomed sense of freedom, but also with the paralyzing horror that had come over me at various times when confronted with the traces of destruction, reaching far back into the past that were evident in even that remote place. In the first sentence, Sebald takes up a theme that Ulrich Breuer has investigated in his book on melancholy and travel. The melancholy person experiencing a feeling of emptiness, in German Leere, related to boredom or Langeweile, seeks therapeutic respite from a voyage. In this case, the voyage involves exercise, walking for hours, another cure for melancholic depression. But more importantly, the trip provides a feeling of freedom, of being carefree, or in German, ungebunden and freizügig. This is the other side of melancholy, the manic exhilaration associated with poetic inspiration. Emptiness is not nothing. It is a space to be filled, and melancholy also provides the creative impulse to fill it. There's a danger, however, or an old superstition, that melancholy, the ailment that appears under the dog star, will only fill us with sick, depressive thoughts. In the case of the Rings of Saturn, this seems to be the case. The feeling of freedom becomes paralyzing horror as soon as the narrator encounters the omnipresent traces of destruction. In fact, one might even say, now with Walter Benjamin, whose writings on melancholy in his book, The German Mourning Play, certainly inspired Sebald, that the feeling of mourning is tied to a, quote, a priori object, and this object is rubble or Trümmer. Here is how Benjamin describes the feelings associated with rubble or the Trümmerfeld. Mourning is the state of mind in which feeling revives the empty world in the form of a mask and derives an enigmatic satisfaction in contemplating it. Every feeling is bound to an a priori object, and the representation of this object is its phenomenology. Accordingly, the theory of mourning, which emerged unmistakably as a pendant to the theory of tragedy, can only be developed into a description of that world which is revealed under the gaze of the melancholy man. How might this theory of mourning and melancholy apply to Sebald? First, it is plausible to read the Rings of Saturn as the literary description of that world which is revealed under the gaze of the melancholy man, which in this case is identifiable as the narrator. It is also clear that the feelings of Sebald's narrator are bound to the same a priori object named by Benjamin, the rubble or the Trümmerfeld, which include the emblematic rings of Saturn, the traces of destruction mentioned on the first page, but also an unending series of rundown buildings, ruins, relics, and eroded landscapes that the narrator encounters on his walks. In Sebald's case, however, the rubble are not merely a metaphor for the empty Lutheran world that Benjamin sees at work in the Mourning Play, but the literal rubble and rubble literature, term in German Trümmerliteratur, for the literature written after the Second World War. In 1997, Sebald delivered lectures on poetics in Zurich under the title Luftkrieg und Literatur, Air, War, and Literature. The English translator replaces the title with the key concept of these lectures, the natural history of destruction. As Sebald's phrase suggests, his protest is not against a world that has been emptied by theology, but one that has been annihilated and devalued by the disasters of history. As Sebald makes clear, the most destructive form of war, air war, is inseparable from the industrial technology that makes it possible. The histories of capitalism and industrial socialism are thus an essential part of the natural history of destruction. Benjamin also provides a precise, if puzzling, description of a poetic operation that occurs in the mind and writings of the melancholic man. Mourning is the state of mind in which feeling revives the empty world in the form of a mask and derives an enigmatic satisfaction in contemplating it. This operation, I would argue, is Benjamin's modification of the traditional link between melancholy and poetic genius. The melancholic gaze sees the empty world as rubble, but it also sees the rubble as a trace of what once was and what has now been destroyed. The imagination revives, or indeed recycles, this world in the form of a mask, which means, I think, that the empty world cannot ever be a full living world, only a mask of that fullness, and the satisfaction enjoyed in the contemplation of this world must remain enigmatic. It is the enjoyment of destruction for the possibility of revival it contains, and at the same time the concession, or perhaps enjoyment, of the impossibility of this revival. Sebald employs this operation throughout the Rings of Saturn. For example, in the novel's third chapter, the narrator has reached the beach about 3 or 4 miles south of Lowestoft, where he finds a group of fishermen lined up in tents along the coast. The narrator is reminded of a scene from the deep past. It is as if the last stragglers, die letzten Überreste, of some nomadic people had settled there at the outermost limit of the earth, in expectation of the miracle longed for since time immemorial, the miracle which would justify all erstwhile privations and wanderings. The irrealis, as if, or as hätte, marks the imagination of the past as fiction, while the metaphor comparing the people to Überreste, remnants, situates the fantasy within the materiality of the novel's archaeological gaze. This scene has the peculiar structure of a Sebaldian negative dialectics, which imagines messianic hope, the emptiness before ruin, only as a feature of an irretrievable past, emptiness after the ruin. For in reality, as the passage continues, these fishermen, quote, just want to be in a place where they have the world behind them and before them nothing but emptiness. In the phrase nothing but emptiness, nichts mehr als Leere, the difference between emptiness and nothing shines through as the enigmatic satisfaction provided by the melancholic gaze, an ambivalent mix of freedom and paralysis. As the passage and the novel continues, Sebald will continue to fill this imagination with traces of destruction. Because the novel narrates walks along the English coast, much of its attention focuses on the ruins of former industry, primarily fishing and tourism, but also the palaces and villas financed by heavy industry. The work culminates with an extended meditation on the textile industry, which links the introduction of silkworms in France to the transformation of landscapes and the grueling work of weavers. As Sebald writes, that weavers, in particular, together with scholars and writers with whom they had much in common, tended to suffer from melancholy and all the evils associated with it, is understandable given the nature of their work, which forced them to sit bent over day after day, straining to keep day after day, straining to keep their eye on the complex patterns they created. Sebald illustrates this work with the graphic you see, one of many images that are interspersed throughout the text. Sebald's text thus invokes the deep sympathy that critical and socialist writers have long felt for workers, and in particular textile workers, a sympathy exemplified in German literature, for example, by Gerhard Hauptmann's drama, The Weavers, first published in 1892. Unlike previous generations of socially engaged writers, however, Sebald does not follow the weavers to their uprising, but instead holds on to the feeling of melancholy that both inspires revolution and returns when revolutions fail. Writing in the 1990s, Sebald also broadens the lens of socialist critique to include the natural environment and meditates on how human industry results in the destruction of nature. The fishermen, namely, remind the narrator of the pollution of the North Sea, which he calls the German Ocean, a melancholic association with this self-exiled author's former home. Every year, the rivers bear thousands of tons of mercury, cadmium, and lead, and mountains of fertilizer and pesticides out into the North Sea. These products of industry decimate the local fish population, which reminds the narrator of other images of destruction of fish, in particular a pedagogical film about herring that he remembers from his childhood. In the mind of the pedagogical filmmaker and the ideal naive child spectator, the herring appears as, quote, the principal emblem, as it were, of the indestructibility of nature. Sebald, of course, recounts how this emblem is destroyed, often in grotesque and likely fictional proportions. 100 years later, in 1770, the number of herring caught annually is estimated to have been 60 billion. Such inconceivable destruction, but also productive power of natural reproduction, leads to a thought that closely resembles the logic of what Sebald will call, in his Zurich lectures, the natural history of destruction. In The Rings of Saturn, this thought appears as a, quote, consolation in the idea that humanity was responsible for only a fraction of the endless destruction wrought in the cycle of life. Following the tradition of critical theory, Sebald's concept of nature is primarily negative and part of a catastrophic dialectics of enlightenment. Is the destruction not, rather, irrefutable proof that the catastrophes which develop, so to speak, in our hands and seem to break out suddenly are a kind of experiment, anticipating the point at which we shall drop out of what we have thought for so long to be our autonomous history and back into the history of nature? In Sebald's view of history, the history of nature is something that you can sink back into, and the sign of this sinking back are destruction and catastrophe. As a novel of post-socialist melancholy, and I come to my conclusion, Sebald's The Rings of Saturn thus points back to the defeat of socialism and the failure of past utopia, but also describes the ecological melancholy of the present day, a depressing state of affairs that requires a new form of utopian imagination. The ecological traces of destruction that serve as the material starting point of Sebald's poetics can thus also be understood as a poetics of the Anthropocene. Like the philosopher Enzo Traverso, Sebald emphasizes the bipolar quality of melancholy, which may fixate on the phenomenology of ruin, but also provides a moment of freedom, a space of imagination that is necessary to picture a world other than it is today, and that is still in our hands to change. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Our last presentation in this session is by Bradley Gorski from Georgetown University in Washington. And the title of presentation is A Soviet Author for Post-Soviet World Literature.
All right, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So first of all, thank you so much to the organizers of this conference. I'm very happy to be here. Share my screen really quickly here. Make sure all that works.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the title of my presentation is a Soviet author in post-Soviet world literature. And what I'm curious about today specifically is the relationship between the post-Soviet novel and world literature writ large. Specifically, I'm interested in what the case of Lyudmila Ulitskaya, the post-Soviet author who, as much as any other, I think, has found success through international networks. I'm curious about what the case of her has to say about the place of Russia in world literature today. So Ulitskaya is interesting to me because she is very much a writer out of time. something she herself is the first to admit. So, for instance, in a 2010 discussion with readers, she said, and I'll read these quotes in English because that's the working language of the conference, but I'll put them all up in their original language. So she said, I was already 50 years old when my first book appeared, and I had so hopelessly fallen behind my contemporaries that it didn't even enter my mind to hurry up and compete on those grounds. So born in 1953, raised and educated in the late Soviet Union, where, among other things, she lost a job for trafficking in samizdat, Ulitskaya aligns herself both aesthetically and ethically with the Шестидесятники, the generation of the 60s, and the late Soviet intelligentsia, much more than with any sort of post-Soviet phenomenon. Though this might come as no surprise to those familiar with her work, what is more surprising is that this nostalgic authorial position, this sort of recycling of late Soviet forms, both of aesthetics and of authorship, has made her one of the most successful authors of the post-Soviet era, both at home and abroad. And part of the reason for her success is how well her work travels. So in a 2006 interview, she said, quote, I first came to know success in its Western variety. My works have been translated into 31 languages, and only after I won the Booker Prize was I appreciated in Russia. Even now, my print runs in the West are bigger than they are here, she said. A look at her early reception suggests that Ulitskaya was greeted abroad precisely as a writer out of time, a female Chekhov, Weiblichen Chekhov, in the words of one German review, who keeps her distance, quote, not only from her characters, but also from her readers. Today's problems are not her subject. In her language, one can hardly tell when and from where the author writes. French critics agreed. So, quote, far from the depressing or sensational stories that other post-Soviet writers enjoy, Ulitskaya asks readers to follow her along a path with characters who are not unrelated to Solzhenitsyn's Matryona, whose kindness makes the world go round. In other words, her success abroad seems to come not despite hopelessly falling behind her post-Soviet colleagues, but precisely because of her retrospective vision. The early works referenced in these reviews, Бедные родственники, Poor Relatives, and Sonyechka, do not touch on the post-Soviet era at all, instead opting for earlier settings, shot through with the familiarity of nostalgia. The plot of Sonyechka, for instance, is constructed from many familiar tropes of the late Soviet intelligentsia. The title character evacuates with her family during the war, where she meets a repressed artist whom she marries and with whom she lives out the Stalin years in exile. During the thaw, the couple moves back to Moscow. His talent is recognized and his past is rehabilitated. But he dies before the Soviet Union ends. And at the end of the book, Sonyechka, the title character, does not face the future alone, but rather sinks into her own nostalgic reading of Bunin and Turgenev, two both nostalgic authors and two authors who traveled very well abroad. One can see why Ulitskaya's work might have been attractive to international audiences in the post-Soviet years. She offers a vision of Soviet life centered on exactly the kinds of people Western audiences might like to believe populated the Soviet Union. That is, the intelligentsia immersed in the consumption and creation of great art. As David Damrosch reminds us, literature travels best when it, quote, conforms to the receiving country's image of what the foreign culture should be. Ulitskaya's work fits precisely this mold, as the US book jacket for The Big Green Tent, Zelyony Shatior, which came out in 2010, but was translated in 2015, makes explicit. So this is the beginning of the book jacket cover there. The Big Green Tent epitomizes what we think of when we imagine the classic Russian novel. With epic breadth and intimate detail, Lyudmila Ulitskaya's remarkable work tells the story of three school friends who meet in Moscow in the 1950s and go on to embody the heroism, folly, compromise, and hope of the Soviet dissident experience. But beyond her subject matter, her style, the formal structures, and many of her works and her public persona all make Ulitskaya's recycling of the Soviet more than a matter of settings and characters. it becomes something much more fundamental, a recycling of forms of authorship and a nostalgic vision of the relationship between literature, readers, and politics. So after Soneczka won the Prix de Medici, Ulickaia was invited to Cognac's annual Salon of European Literature, where she represented Russia. Reports on her activities in the French press suggest that the nostalgic late Soviet vision of her work has clearly transferred to her public image. So one report from the Salon in Cognac, titled The Russian Soul and Its Demons, L'âme russe et ses démons, for instance, opens with a reminder of the Soviet writer's plight, recalling Mikhail Bulgakov's confrontation with Stalin, before noting that Russian writers today experience two kinds of oppression, quote, ideological and economic. This is in 1999. Lyudmila Ulickaia, this is the quote that's up there. Lyudmila Ulickaia, for example, winner of the Prix Medici Étranger in 1996 for Soneczka, she says one has to, quote, write 4 books a year to make a living. Sales function poorly as a mechanism for supporting literary production, complains this former geneticist dismissed in the 1970s from the USSR Academy of Sciences for her love of banned authors, Solzhenitsyn and others. In socialist times, literary production was well organized. That's Ulickaia again. There were thematic plans. These days, some authors have to make their living in other ways. End of quote. By interrupting Ulickaia's quote with her history of banned literature, this article implicitly connects post-Soviet market pressures to Soviet oppression and uses the structural similarity to assign the 1990s Russian writer a place analogous to that of her Soviet counterpart. This type of thinking recreates a place for that valuable international commodity, the persecuted Soviet writer, even as the Soviet Union and its persecution have disappeared. Ulickaia's personal history, as well as her fictional focus on the late Soviet era, make her ideally suited to fit into this place. It is no wonder that she was invited to the Cognac Salon, which included such panels as The European Dream of Russia, Le Rêve Européen de la Russie, and Communist Past, Russian Future, Passé communiste avenir russe. Such panels almost explicitly imagine post-Soviet Russian literature as repeating the forms of Soviet literature. And in this pattern, Ulickaia plays the part of the Soviet dissident. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, she wrote an essay in Der Spiegel entitled Farewell Europe. Her government's aggression, she wrote, had driven Russia out of the community of nations and had set in motion an isolationism reminiscent of Soviet times. At a conference called Ukraine-Russia Dialogue in Kiev the same year, she began her talk by noting, quote, though we don't want to return to Soviet times, that is precisely what it smells like. Хотя мы не хотим возвращаться в советские времена, но именно этим сейчас сильно пахнет. Later that year, Masha Gessen profiled her in the New Yorker under the subtitle, One of Russia's Most Famous Writers Confronts the State. In a French interview a few years later, she was asked whether she was considered an enemy of the people. Yes, she responded, just like in the good old days. Her response was sarcastic, of course, on the one hand, suggesting that the good old days should not be understood as good at all. On the other hand, though, her response evokes a structural opposition between state and writer, reminiscent of those good old days. She reminds readers and herself of the cultural power that opposition provided, and she also positions herself within those past forms. In this way, Ulickaia's success abroad can be accounted for, at least in part, through her activation of a kind of formal nostalgia that works on at least 2 levels. First, her elegant prose, clear realism, and kind characters stand in stark contrast to most post-Soviet literature, and instead remind readers of Chekhov, Solzhenitsyn, and other classics of Russian letters. But beyond that, her public positioning evokes a nostalgia for the forms of authorship and readership of the late Soviet era, when authors stood heroically against the state, and when literature carried much more importance for society as a whole. Sergei Ushakin has argued that nostalgia can be understood as a, quote, longing for the positive structuring effects that old shapes could produce, even when they are not supported by their primary contexts. Ulitskaya's ability to invoke the old shapes of literary relations allow audiences to give familiar structure to the unfamiliar post-Soviet world. But I think the relationship between her nostalgic texts and her authorial persona bears a bit more scrutiny. It is a carefully crafted relationship. And it is through that relationship that I think we can glimpse how Ulitskaya's recycling of the Soviet is not simply a matter of nostalgia, but also a form of grief, a melancholia that recycles old forms as a response to death and loss. And here I see a really productive conversation with Tim coming up here. This connection can perhaps best be understood through a reading, which will unfortunately have to be very brief, of The Funeral Party, Весёлые похороны, a novel in which the main character's death coincides with the death of the Soviet Union. The novella is set in New York, and not incidentally, it was Ulitskaya's first work to be translated into English. It centers on an emigre artist named Alik, who is dying in his studio as his friends gather around him, joined by their common love for him and by their shared immigrant experience. Alik's last days coincide with the 1991 August coup, and Alik's friends watch on TV as the last gasps of a dying Soviet Union are broadcast simultaneously with Alik's dying breath. The simultaneous deaths of Alik and the Soviet Union activate the past for each of the characters. Quote, the past from which they had more or less fundamentally isolated themselves once again entered their lives. Прошлое, от которого они более или менее основательно отгородились, снова вошло в их жизнь. Imminent death and loss activate a nostalgia, and they remember their lives in the Soviet Union, their immigrant experiences, and their encounters with Alik. And it is those memories that weave the fabric of the novel. If the immigrant experience has brought these characters together, it is death and loss that have activated their past, brought their stories to the surface, and in this way created the novella itself. In other words, the novella is created by the loss at its center. It is also worth noting that the dying man is an artist, who it turns out in the last chapter is quite successful in the international art market, which further ties the generative loss at the center of the novel to artistic creation. So for Ulitskaya in this work and many others, creativity arises from death, loss, and nostalgia. And so it is no wonder that her authorial position would also be associated with a past era. In fact, Ulitskaya makes this connection explicit at times by seamlessly replacing her characters with herself. An epilogue to her first novel, Medea and Her Children, for instance, puts her in the place of a protagonist who had died long ago. Even more explicit is the cover of a 2006 Russian reprint of The Funeral Party. There, an inscription signed by Ulitskaya on the book jacket reads, let's see, there it is. Who has not stood next to that black hole, the passing of a loved one? Grief, fear, despair, the impossibility of making peace with that unavoidable law of life. All living things die. The Funeral Party, though, promises comfort. Quote, and this is at the end here of the book jacket. This is a story of a person who did everything possible to leave after his passing, not a black hole of despair, but an atmosphere of peace and love. Such things happen. I am a witness. And then it's signed by Ulitskaya. Unlike her character, the author does not die, but instead positions herself as a comforting presence alongside the dying, generating creativity in the form of witnessing in the face of loss. This authorial position, the author alongside the dying Soviet era, has found significant resonance across cultures, energizing Ulitskaya's world literary circulation since at least since the very early 1990s. Before The Funeral Party was published, and certainly before this book jacket, Ulitskaya made a somewhat unexpected appearance in the French press. An obituary for Ilya Ehrenburg's daughter, Irina, that ran in Le Monde in June 1997, for instance, begins, Irina Ehrenburg was one of those grand dames of the Soviet regime, tolerated simply because they were just as strong as it was, in their own way. In the case of Ehrenburg, it was personal elegance, at once moral and intellectual, that kept the executioners at bay. She died on June 17th in Moscow in the arms of her neighbor, Lyudmila Ulitskaya, Prix Medici Étranger, 1996, in her small apartment full of books and paintings on Red Army Street. She was 86 years old. Playing much the same role as she assigns herself on the cover of The Funeral Party, Ulitskaya here is shown to be a witness to the passing of a bygone era. Her literary credentials, given in discrete parentheses, figure her both as a continuation of the, quote, intellectual and moral elegance that defined Ehrenburg and her generation, and a distinctly post-Soviet author who wins international prizes and circulates across world literary networks. So what does Ulitskaya's success tell us about the relationship between the post-Soviet novel and world literature? World literature as a way of thinking about international circulation is supposed to be a market paradigm, a, quote, uninterrupted network, according to Franco Moretti, or a, quote, unified world literary space, according to Pascal Casanova, not dependent on politics and certainly not on Cold War legacies. So while Ulitskaya's popularity confirms David Damarish's intuition that literature travels best when it confirms stereotypes, it also troubles the world literary paradigm by recycling Cold War politics in what should be a market-based global vision. In this context, I want to end just by asking, does Ulitskaya's circulation, asking sort of what Ulitskaya's circulation means. Does Ulitskaya's circulation simply show that international audiences are nostalgic for Cold War culture? That we want a world in which politics and literature are interconnected in clear and predictable ways? Does it suggest a dissatisfaction with the market-based paradigm of world literature and a desire for real-world heroism and not just marketable works from authors? Or on the other hand, does Ulitskaya's international circulation represent the domestication of political concerns or subordination of political concerns to an international market? Recycled Soviet political positions, mostly bereft of contemporary relevance, nevertheless effectively energize commodity circulation through these post-Soviet cultural markets. Or perhaps does Ulitskaya's international circulation participate in her evocation of grief? Does her nostalgic position in world literature represent a mourning for a lost world, a melancholic recognition of its recoverability, and a continuing desire to look backwards, not forwards? I would love to hear your thoughts on those questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So that's the last presentation in this panel, and we have approximately an hour, quite plenty of time to have questions, comments, and discussion. So the floor is open, and who will be willing to start the discussion? Oh, I got one question to Yanis. Perhaps it's not exactly related to the topic of the presentation, but still somehow at least related to sort of the whole topic of the conference. So you told about Latvian novels from the Soviet period republished in post-Soviet Latvia, but what about, for example, Russian or Russian language Soviet novels? Are they republished in post-Soviet Latvia, and how people deal with them, or Are there any specific popular Soviet Russian-speaking writers, so on?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I've been thinking about it, but actually very few cases except one. This is a book by Pikul, who, as you know, lived in Riga, and he still has 2 memorial plaques, I think, in Riga, and some people go to Riga Major Cemetery to visit his graveyard, but I think he's almost forgotten, both in Russia and in post-Soviet space, and actually very few of his novels were translated into Latvian during Soviet time. He was, of course, published in mass circulation, and people who were interested read him and his works in Russian. But first of his translations into Latvian appeared in 80s and some even in 90s. So this is something that traveled through the times. But I haven't noticed anything else. Actually, yes, I've been also listening to Bradley's presentation and thinking about Ulitska's case, and also she's not very popular in Latvia. She has, I think there are 2 or 3 of her books translated. I just checked the internet. The last one was Media in 2013. Also, some of the books by Lena Eltang was translated. She lives in Vilnius, but also with very minor success. So translations from Russian is something that is still missing, both from Soviet period and post-Soviet period. I think you noticed.
Thank you. That's interesting, and indeed, Pikul, who was enormously popular in the late Soviet years, now is completely forgotten in Russia. Actually, that's interesting. Any more questions or comments?
Alexander, can I?
Yeah, sure. Please.
I have 2 questions. First one for Yanis. I'm wondering about the general approaches of evaluation Latvian literature during Soviet times. In your presentation, you mentioned probably 2 or 3 times the term occupation. So how it is represented as a Latvian literature under Soviet occupation, on any other titles circulating among general public? And I'm sorry, probably second question also for you. You mentioned several books. Is any of these books included in school curricula? So they kind of included in the contemporary canon of Latvian literature. And second question for Bradley. And I'm kind of a little bit concerned about the general term a Soviet author applying for Ulitskaya. If I'm mistaken, just correct me, please, but she debuted somewhere in the late Soviet times, or became quite known at the beginning of the independent Russia. So can you provide any arguments why you think that a Soviet author is a better term in introducing Ulitskaya? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, so the occupation and occupation regime is something we have agreed on and use it with no discussion. And if we speak about this school curriculum, yes, so the few of the books I mentioned by Marģeris Zariņš and by Zigmunds Skuiņš, they were published within the series for schools. So it means that their books are included in the school curriculum, and particularly these re-editions and new editions include scholars' preface and also some comments, but no, they're full-length novels. And as I don't know, I think it's a common issue both in Russia and in Latvia, that actually very few of literary works have to be read in full length. So pupils, they learn some biographies, some fragments, some excerpts, and in many cases these thick novels, they become like just a choice between several novels, for instance, to read during their free time. It doesn't mean that all the pupils have to read all these books in full, but most of them do, yes. So they have to choose between, like, if they have like 3 novels from the period, they choose one and discuss it. Of course, it helps to keep these books and authors alive. Yeah, about Ulitska, I think this is the question to Bradley. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, absolutely. The calling her a Soviet author was meant to be polemical. She was born and sort of, formed her consciousness, and I think a lot of what comes out in her literature comes from the Soviet era, but I don't mean to say that she was a Soviet author in the sense that that's when she was published, although she did have, as you mentioned, a couple of small journal publications in the very late Soviet years. But yeah, her first book-length publication was already in 1991 or 92, I think, and she is mostly of the post-Soviet era. But the way that she sort of positions herself as an author, the way that she writes, the type of language, the type of settings, these are all sort of the Soviet era. And I tried to emphasize that I see her as a sort of author out of time. She is in the post-Soviet era, but she is very much continuing a lot of the traditions of Soviet authorship, both how she relates to her readers, but also what she writes about and how she constructs her works.
Any more questions or comments? Valera, please.
I have a question to Bradley Gorsky. Maybe my question will be a little bit difficult because I am not sure that I can to explain my position correctly, maybe exactly, but maybe you can guess what I mean. I will be appreciate about this. I'm thinking in terms. I'm trying to think about terms of cultural recycling and about this notion. And during the first panel, they talk about the opposition. They discussed the opposition between cultural recycling, nostalgia, trauma, and tradition. One of our speakers told that she does not use tradition in their thinking about the cultural situation at all, because it is not relevant for cultural anthropology, for some system of thinking in cultural anthropology. I'm not sure that I can refuse this notion as maybe other colleagues, because, for example, the my first meeting with historical meeting with cultural recycling was perhaps I met it in the works of Baudrillard, and Baudrillard, as we know, oppose tradition and cultural recycling. Tradition is something what is continuous now, recycling what is updated every minute, every day, like news, fashion, and so on. This is just one of understanding of cultural recycling and tradition, but tradition continues. This is the main point. You you told that Ulitska is the author out of time, so she belongs to tradition. cultural recycling in ecological terms, not in Baudrillard's, but in ecological in general, refer to the situations then a cultural value should be dropped out to the trash box before using again. So we see that Ulitskaya was not dropped out. It was not updated at all. So this is one point which I can notice in your paper, your interested paper. I'm just point out some thesis of because I will try to think about them later. Now I just point out them. Another thing which is interesting for me in your paper, it seems to me that you look at Ulitskaya in two perspectives. One of them, you consider Ulitskaya as a sort of as an object of recycling. He is an object of recycling, a cultural value which goes beyond one era to another era, beyond one cultural situation to another cultural situation. First, this is the first aspect. Another aspect different. It seems to me that you consider Ulitskaya as a recycler. You mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that she being in opposition to Soviet power some years ago, some time ago. Now, remember Soviet past as not bad past, but something, but as a sort of value which we need now. So she is a recycler. This is absolutely different perspective for me. I don't know what is my question, but maybe you can comment on my notes, something, tell about my notes, my thoughts about your paper.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for these really rich comments. I think that's extremely helpful. Yeah, I see this distinction that you're pointing out between recycling and tradition, and I think that's absolutely right. I think this actually resonates pretty well with Valentina's question, in the sense that Ulitskaya is not a Soviet writer who sort of continued doing the same thing. You could look at maybe Vasily Aksionov doing something similar, right? Who sort of transitions over the late Soviet to post-Soviet period and doesn't change his sort of mode of presentation. He's still a sort of dissident author. That might be somebody continuing a tradition. But what I think is interesting about Ulitskaya is that she doesn't have any success internationally or any sort of name internationally until the post-Soviet era. And yet, even in that post-Soviet era, when censorship is lifted, when sort of the persecution of writers is no longer a mainstay of post-Soviet Russia, she still performs that mode of authorship. So I think she is kind of resurrecting, in a sense, the way that late Soviet authors would present themselves on sort of tamizdat circuits. And this is interesting. It's not a sort of long it's not a long time that mode of authorship was in the trash heap, but you can see her very much in distinction to some of the more popular authors on the international circuit at the time, say Viktor Yerofeyev, who is in the very sort of early post-Soviet years, in the early to mid 90s, one of the big names in international, sort of being translated and in international circles about Russian literature. And that French quote that I had up there that says, unlike other post-Soviet authors, Ulitskaya is not interested in the shocking or the grotesque. That's a direct sort of reference to people like Sorokin and Yerofeyev and others like that. And it seems like in the face of that, which is the mainstream of post-Soviet writers, Ulitskaya is sort of recycling a more kind, gentle, sort of late Soviet sort of dissident mode. So I think that there is something going on here, which is a little closer to recycling, or at least I wanted to think about it in the terms of this conference as a little closer to recycling than a continuation of a tradition. Although there is that as well. Ulicka is really interesting in the sense that she, in Sonichka, for instance, Sonichka, the main character, is reading Bunin and Turgenev, and these are two authors who are, the most popular authors of their own era in France. They are the most sort of, they're the best translated authors of their own eras, and these sort of continuing looking back each generation from Ulicka to Pasternak, and then from Pasternak to Bunin, and then from Bunin to Turgenev. All of this does this tradition, right? So it does have a traditional element. There is a continuation element, but it does seem to be in opposition to the sort of mainstream of post-Soviet, at least as far as world literature goes. The question about the object of recycling versus recycler, I think, is also really fascinating. One of the things I think is interesting about Ulicka as a public persona is that she was very interested in participating in her own marketization. So I think, I'm not sure where the first part of it comes from. I'm not sure if she sort of is recognized by the German press as a female Chekhov, as I had up on there. And then she sort of plays into that role, or if she thinks of herself as that first. But there's a symbiotic relationship between how she presents herself and how she is portrayed. So I think she is both an object of recycling and a recycler. And she is interested in sort of both sides of that. I'm really interested in what happened with that obituary for Irina Ehrenburg. I'm not sure if it is the sort of publicist for Ulitskaya who told somebody that Irina Ehrenburg died in her arms. How did Le Monde know, that Ulitskaya was there for her death? Is that something that Ulitskaya herself told the press, or is that something that Ehrenburg's estate said? And how does that come up? So there are instances like this where I think that you can sort of see her working, or somebody aligned with her working on this same sort of set of recycling issues that I think she's being pulled into also by the press.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Tim,
Yes, thank you.
Your question.
Yeah, I have two questions for Bradley. I think there's some interesting resonance between Ulitskaya and Sebald. That's the first question, is about, for Sebald, one could say that he's more popular internationally than in Germany, or at least was in the initial instance, partly because he lived in England. Is that also something you can observe with Ulitskaya? Is this international circulation that you were talking about at the expense of a local reception? And then my other question is, I thought it was very interesting, the question of of longing and mourning. And I was just wondering if you could specify what you think she is mourning for, what is lost. I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned sort of the possibility of the form of the novel, but maybe also a kind of reading culture that would have interesting resonance with the history of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, which Germans call the reading country, that's Leseland. So there's a sort of sense of loss of a literary culture as the primary object, or whether that has something to do with socialism or socialist utopia, sort of more political aspects as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I completely agree. I really got a lot of your paper, took a lot of notes, and I will formulate a question and probably write you about it later. So thank you for that. Yeah, so the Ulitskaya is interesting. Her sort of work in the 90s definitely found more resonance abroad than at home. And as she mentions in that quote that I put up there, she won the Russian Booker Prize in 2001 for a book called The Case of Kusotsky. And that sort of, it's interesting also that the Russian Booker Prize is itself an import. So this British prize is what brought her Russian success in the end. But her most popular work is also called Daniel Stein Переводчик, Daniel Stein Translator. And this book is her first work that is not at all set in Russia. There are very few Russian characters, but this is her sort of most resonant book at home. So she has an interesting play between Russian and international audiences, which I think is kind of interesting. However, I wouldn't say that her success abroad is at the expense of her domestic success. In fact, I think that her success abroad sort of generated her domestic success. And if you look at a lot of her book covers that come out in the 2000s, it mentions how well she is translated, how much she is sort of, all these prizes that she's won abroad, and the way that she sort of is able to circulate through international circuits and then bring it back home, I think is one of the interesting parts about it. That Daniel Stein Translator book is also punctuated by letters to her friend, and they're sort of first-person letters about the difficulty of her writing this book. And when you look up who this friend is, it is a longtime friend, but it's also her international literary agent, which is an interesting connection there as well. The other question, the melancholia. Yeah, I think that she is really interested in this this sort of mourning for a lost readerly culture. She was part of sort of samizdat circles when she was a geneticist, when she was a scientist in the late Soviet era, and she actually got caught with illicit texts and was dismissed from her work because of that. And in her later works now, she talks a lot about that sort of, well, in her earlier works as well, a lot about samizdat circuits as well as the sort of reading culture of the late Soviet era. So that's definitely something that she is, that she's nostalgic about. I think she is less interested in this sort of political utopian project of the Soviet era. She's very much interested in the late Soviet era, not in revolutionary Soviet history. And even though some of that stuff comes up in her works, it's very much in the background. So I think she's kind of a late Soviet liberal more than a late Soviet leftist in any way, and that is the sort of nostalgia that she seems to be evoking as well there.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Bradley, please.
Yeah, I actually did. I'm trying to formulate this question for Tim, and I was really moved by this image of the how melancholy evokes a world as a mask, but not as a living world. And I'm wondering how you can see that sort of connected to utopian thinking. In other words, how does the mask then sort of begin to conjure possibilities for future renewal under the mask? Is it something where the sort of, if we push the metaphor maybe too far, the sort of actor under the mask starts living into the culture of the mask? Or is it because the sort of renewal of performative nostalgia or performative melancholy brings something new to the real lived experience there? Just how do you sort of see that relationship playing out?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I would answer it. It gives me the opportunity to connect this idea of the mask to cultural recycling, because I think that because it's only a mask, it's not fully revived. That mask place, or the place of the ruin, is the trash heap that Valerie mentioned, right? So you have to imagine both the destruction and the what has been destroyed behind it. So I think that is how I imagine sort of interpreting, I mentioned in just one phrase that this revive in Benjamin's text could be translated as recycle, perhaps and I think that's how I would do it. The other part is how that relates to utopia. I think that it's with an emphasis on the no place of utopia in the tradition. So the fact that utopian potential is not real and cannot be realized naively in any way, but is instead related to this critical view of the current state of affairs. So utopia is the counter image of what is part of the melancholy view of the current state of affairs. And that's how it is in Burton. And that's maybe more actually in that view is a little bit different than this more tradition of islands where you kind of imagine how it actually is, but instead you kind of have a utopian dimension that opens up once I mean, this is the critical theory, the big move is negation. So you negate the world, and that's what opens up the utopia. So the you as no and negation is the important part, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Well, since I don't see any hands lifted up and anything in the chat as well, so perhaps it's time to close this panel. Well, thank you for attending. My thanks to all the presenters for their brilliant presentations. And the next session will start at 5 p.m. after the break. Thank you very much.